Great. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for our panel on U.S.-China relations. We have a great group of people, an interesting topic, and we have modest plans to solve U.S.-China relations in 50 minutes. So buckle in and stay tuned. As folks know, the U.S.-China relationship is really at the top of U.S. policymakers' minds for a variety of very good reasons. The Obama administration made it a centerpiece of their foreign policy. Secretary Clinton's first trip as Secretary of State was to Asia. President Obama just visited Asia. It was his 8th in-person meeting with President Xi. 8 years before that, President Bush had taken his final trip to Asia to see the Beijing Olympics. And much has changed in those 8 years as we think about. Now we reach the presidential election cycle, where the candidacy of Secretary Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump have raised new questions about what is the future of U.S.-China relations and what can we expect. And as we think about the long list of issues between our two countries, be it cybersecurity, North Korea, climate change, the South China Sea, if then we get to a core question, which is how do we think about this relationship in a way that it can truly be strategic and move away from the zero-sum, potentially conflictual nature of this? And those are some of the topics we're going to take up today. The three terrific panelists we have their bios in the books, so I'm going to do a very brief introduction as I ask them questions, which will definitely do injustice to the great work and expertise they bring. But let me turn first to Jeff Bader. Jeff was the special assistant to President Obama for East Asian affairs, a key architect of Obama administration's policy towards China and broader Asia. And Jeff, I'll start with you. I was thinking back as we started, and you and I traveled to Asia together in 2010. We were both at the White House. We went with Tom Dolan and Larry Summers, saw the president of China, a variety of high-ranking officials. And one thing we talked about a fair amount was what the rebalance actually meant. So now that we stand towards the end of the end of the Obama administration, the question I wanted to start with you is, what has it accomplished in the last 7 years? But more importantly, what is it not? Where has it not met expectations, and what's next?
Well, Matt, I think that the main purpose of the rebalance was to get the United States more deeply engaged in the part of the world that President Obama saw as the most dynamic, the most economically advancing, the one that would be most important to U.S. Interests in the 21st century. He wanted to move away from excessive involvement in the affairs and the wars of Western Asia and concentrate on where the growth and development was. So I think there were three principal components. There's the Northeast Asia allies component, the China component, and the Southeast Asia component. And all of them were meant to be mutually reinforcing. Northeast Asia, principally the alliances with Japan and South Korea, both were strengthened in important ways, and both have continued to be strengthened as the administration has continued in ways we can get into more in Q&A. But the relationship with Prime Minister Abe, with Lee Myung-bak, and with Park Geun-hye has seen really a substantial reinforcement of the relationships and particular security relationships with both. With Southeast Asia, I think that was really, in some ways, the most innovative part of the rebalance, paying much more attention to Southeast Asia than had been the case in the past. President Obama has met annually with the 10 ASEAN leaders, something that had never happened before President Obama. The United States joined the East Asia Summit and has been working to try to make it into the principal security and political body in the region. Stronger relations with Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, key countries. I hesitate to say the Philippines right now, but with the key countries in the region, and of course the focus on the South China Sea that we've seen since Hillary Clinton's speech at the ASEAN Regional Forum in 2010. And finally, China. China was not meant, as some believe, to be the target of the rebalance. It was meant to be part of the rebalance. We want to have a deeper and more extensive relationship with China. And there have been a lot of accomplishments in the U.S.-China relationship. The last trip by President Obama focusing on the climate change agreement, but before that, the working with the Chinese on the Iran denuclearization program, the key role of China in that. Global issues more generally, working with the Chinese agreements on military agreements to avoid hostile encounters in international air and international sea. But some tensions, particularly in the East Asian region, over South China Sea, less than perfect cooperation on North Korea, and the perpetual issue of Taiwan, of course. So what's unresolved? Just in 30 seconds, the key security issue going forward for the U.S. clearly is going to be North Korea. We've seen that with the nuclear test recently, and perhaps another nuclear test, and with North Korea's development of ICBMs designed to reach the United States. So that, I think, is going to be a probably the top priority for the next president in the region. Obviously, the management of U.S.-China relations is not something that one resolves. That's a perpetual issue, and that will be at the top of the agenda of the next president. And finally, South China Sea, not how we resolve the issues of the South China Sea, but how we manage them and prevent them from becoming a source of warfare rather than a source of some level of friction.
Thank you, Jeff. Professor Luming, I'll turn to you next to get a perspective from the other side of the Pacific. Professor Liu is professor and executive director of the Institute of International Relations at the Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences. Professor Liu, I guess my question for you on the other side is, how is the rebalance that Ambassador Bader spoke about, particularly with respect to China, how is that viewed from within China?
And we all know Bader's view is quite balanced and put China into the final maybe component. But what China read is from the whole situation change and security, economically, and South China Sea issue. So it looks like, or it seems to China, China is in the core and corner place and of this rebalance strategy, and which is first called pivot to Asia, and then they have different views, White House and State Department, and finally changed the name called rebalance strategy, geographical, as Bader mentioned, Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, military, economically, and politically, and so it's quite a balance, yeah. But actually, we know, and in this before 2009 and 2008, before this the financial crisis, China was, quite successful in its relation with Southeast Asia country, or some people say China took the advantage of U.S. Was fully preoccupied with anti-terrorism, yeah. So a kind of China rising caused the U.S. kind of anxiety, and of course China's activity in South China Sea make some neighboring country make a lot of complaint to U.S. So these are kind of things, and finally decide that U.S. adopt such kind of strategy. Of course, this strategy is not totally 100% met China. We should be more fair, but China always is in a hidden or in an open way, is in the heart of this strategy. Whether this is a containment policy, or it's a rebalancing, or it's more neutral and reaction, I think different people will have different views inside China. I think different, some liberal view, or some maybe hawkish view. Anyhow, which lead to China's kind of reaction to the U.S.
I think you hit the nail on the head with the range of views that you see with respect to the rebalance. Is it containment? Is it rebalance? The one thing about the rebalance is everyone seems to have their own interpretation of exactly what it is. So allows a fair amount of creativity. But on the point you raised, because there's such a spectrum of views, there's a fair amount of misperception going on in the relationship, it seems. So in your perspective, Professor Liu, what are the sources of some of that misperception between the United States and China?
In China's view, always, first, China want to catch up with U.S. And it tried to, particularly when Xi Jinping come to power, want to reshape the regional order. So this is a kind of point, but which will be interpreted by the neighboring country, by the U.S., and you will try to change the state course. You will change this order and set by the U.S. and the other allies after the Second World War. So something maybe will not be accepted by the others. So this is something look like that all the international relations theories that a new rising power will sooner or later will challenge the kind of superiority or the distribution of benefits and or order, and which the superpower or established power set. So this is the first point. Second point is that on U.S. always think maybe China is because of different systems and because its decision making is not quite transparent, and it serves a lot of uncertain development. So U.S. doesn't know much about China's leaders, so want to keep such kind of superiority. I think this is a kind of both sides misperception, misunderstanding of each other's intention will lead, accelerate more competition.
Thank you. Ambassador Haki-san, let me bring Ambassador Bill Haki-san in. Ambassador Haki-san is the Ambassador at Large at the Minister of Foreign Affairs at Singapore. He's had many senior positions in the Singaporean government. You know, and as we think about some of these broad issues, you know, getting specific, one thing we haven't talked about much is the South China Sea so far. You know, an area where U.S.-China relations really plays out for other countries in the region. So I don't know both of you have reactions to some things said before, but in particular, how do you see this plays off over what's happening in the South China Seas?
Well, it seems to us that the US and China are groping towards some new modus vivendi with each other. And I use the word groping deliberately because I don't think that either side really knows what it wants from the other yet. The South China Sea has emerged as something of a proxy for these broader adjustments that are going on between the US and China. Now, I think we should neither downplay the importance of the South China Sea nor exaggerate it. On the whole, ASEAN and China do not have a bad relationship, and that includes the claimant states. However, it is a fact, whether you like it or not, that disputes over sovereignty are going to cast the darkest kind of shadows over relationships, particularly when they are an extremely asymmetrical relationship as between ASEAN and China. What we hope for, I agree with Jeff Bader, I don't think these disputes will ever be resolved, but they can be managed. They were managed quite well for quite a long time. It is only in the last 5 or 6 years that they have, the level of tension has risen. But there are certain things that concern us. First of all, I think it's a fact that small countries who live on the periphery of a large country are always going to feel a certain degree of anxiety. Now, it's got nothing to do with the intentions of the large country, it is just has to do with the disparity of size. So large countries do have a responsibility to reassure, which I think China has only partially fulfilled, particularly with regard to the South China Sea. What worries us, claimants and non-claimants beyond, is that China asserts its claims. There's nothing intrinsically different, unusual with a country having sovereignty disputes. It happens all the time, you know. But it's how they are managed is important. Increasingly, we see China moving away from making its case for its claims on the basis of accepted principles of international law, including UNCLOS, to a reliance on history. That's a bit worrying because for other reasons, China has such a long history, it can be used to justify almost anything. I do understand the importance of the South China Sea to China. Admiral Wu Shengli recently, he's the commander of the PLA Navy, told visiting another admiral, it wasn't Admiral Harris, I can't remember who he was, but he said, this is a core issue, South China Sea is a core issue connected to the governance of the Communist Party. And I think that's right. I mean, that's what I have always thought, and Admiral Wu made it explicit. China, the Communist Party justifies its rule by a historical narrative of having led the great rejuvenation of China after what the Chinese call 100 years of humiliation. And the South China Sea is part of that narrative. What we have now is a kind of, if you like, stalemate. On the one hand, because it is such an important issue connected to what is the most core of Chinese core interest, which is the preservation of Communist Party rule, I don't think the Chinese will ever compromise. So the United States cannot make China dig up these islands and throw the sand back in the sea. It cannot stop China deploying military assets on these islands. But as you heard Admiral Blair say during lunch, and I entirely agree with him, in a purely military sense, the utility of these assets and these artificial islands is quite minimal. If there is a serious conflict, which I don't think is likely, but if there's a serious conflict, he said half an hour, I think he was being kind, it would take less time for them to disappear. However, they do serve this very important domestic political purpose. So you can't deter the Chinese from doing that thing. And if you can't, certainly none of the Southeast Asian countries can. But by that same token, neither can the Chinese deter the US from operating in and through the South China Sea. To try to do that would be a casus belli, a cause for war. Right? And if there is a war, I think the PLA leadership and the Chinese Communist Party leadership knows that it can only have one outcome, and it would put the thing that they hold most dear, which is the preservation of Communist Party rule, in grave jeopardy, if not destroyed. So what I see happening in the South China Sea is, at a very early stage though, a certain ritualization of US-China competition. There'll be a lot of shouting, there'll be a lot of chest thumping on both sides. But you look beyond that, there is an effort, I think, to make this competition as predictable and as manageable as possible. Earlier this year, Admiral Harris, whom we heard last night, said in Singapore, at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, that actually dangerous incidents are very rare. In other words, I think, although it is not within the zone of applicability, the kind of code for unplanned encounters at sea and the air that you have agreed with China for the Pacific is de facto being implemented in Southeast Asia. So it's good. And this kind of indeterminate situation, I think, is going to last for a very long time.
That's fascinating. I think Groping Towards Understanding is the title of a good book, not usually a foreign policy book that we hear about. Jeff and Professor, your reactions to these views on the South China Sea?
Well, I think, as usual, Ambassador Bilahari has said it better than anyone. I mean, look, there are really four dimensions to the issues in the South China Sea. There are the legal dimensions. There is the potential strategic rivalry between the US and China. There are the sovereignty claims. And there are the disputes over resources, which means basically fish and energy resources. And the international law one is the one that the US cares about. That's the one that Secretary Clinton spoke about. That's what the Permanent Court of Arbitration ruling in The Hague was about. And frankly, that's what we care about. And that's what we should be seeking to get assurances about. to make sure that, just go back to the ruling for a second. The most important thing in that ruling, in my view, was that it basically said that there is no feature in the South China Sea that is entitled to more than a 12-mile territorial sea, period. None is entitled to a 200-mile exclusive economic zone, none. And so what that means is, from the US point of view, who cares who controls which rock? It only controls 12 miles. It won't interfere in any way with freedom of navigation of US vessels. So to the extent that that ruling is followed, and that provides the basis under international law for the future, the principal US concern is addressed. The sovereignty claims, all we care about is that they get resolved peacefully. And so far, China has been restrained. They have not taken down anyone else's feature. And as you all know, the Vietnamese have about 28 or 30 features that they occupy. China only has about 7 or 8. Philippines has comparable number, Malaysia comparable number. So China's pretty late to the game, and China has so far not attacked anyone else's features. Resources, I think that they could do something. I think that the claimants could do something. Energy doesn't much matter. Energy prices are sufficiently low so that the attractiveness of energy resources in the South China Sea right now is minimal. But the South China Sea has been overfished. The idea of drawing lines in the South China Sea and say Malaysia can fish here and Vietnam can fish there and China can fish here strikes me as, on its face, ridiculous. There ought to be an agreement among all the claimants basically saying the South China Sea as a whole is open to fishing fleets from all countries, and we're going to have an overall commission that limits catches. It seems to me that's something that the claimants could do. And finally, there's the US-China rivalry issue. And that is the most dangerous, and both Professor Liu and Ambassador Bilhari spoke about it. I think we need to try to keep a cap on that.
Professor, your views?
First, I just have a reaction to the core interesting or historical claim. And I think historical claim exists for a long time, and which lay a foundation for China's future negotiation with those claimers. And I don't think China will want to claim the whole vast areas of the water features, whatever. So this is just a serve as a kind of a foundation. And we always say the historic claim as well as implementation, and these onslaughts are the two components. And international law is among them, and we don't think we will totally abandon this. We will not abide this international law, even after this trial ruling. Some people suggest, since you don't like this onslaught, and which will maybe grab a lot of Chinese interests or sovereignty interests away, so why you should not withdraw this kind of the convention? But I think the most of people still think we should be a part of it. I think on the whole, China will support this convention, but accept this kind of ruling. And the South China Sea actually is not just a legal issue. This is also a political issue. So it's a very complicated, as we say, a lot of overlapping areas. So any kind of a single legal ruling could solve all those political issues, and which will cover a vast area of the water, which I don't think Chinese will accept. What Admiral Wu Senli mentioned, I think is a kind of a general position. But I don't think it leads to that China will not make any compromise. Look at China's history. I mean, Communist Party's history. Or most of the 18 borderland country, we signed now 12 countries with a borderland treaty. Some are very complicated. With Russia, actually, China made a lot of concession. PA complained a lot for Jiang Zemin, but finally, you said this kind of a treaty, the border settlement. So for the maritime settlement, I think still China look forward if all the claimants could make some concession. But the problem is that no claimants now want to make a concession. Vietnam, 29 island or features, and Philippines, 7. all these countries, nationalist sentiments are very strong. This is the kind of case different with Europe. China is the same case. Yeah. So at this point, I think manage the situation, manage the tension, I think is a kind of solution. And I agree with Bader's view. If we could reach to some temporary or tentative agreement like fishing rights, and China, the Philippines, like in Huangyan, we call Huangyan, or the Philippines called the other names. I think that would be a big step, yeah, further. And later we could do more. But for the joint development, which Senior Deng Xiaoping initiated, I don't think it could work because Vietnam, Philippines, they will not accept any kind of joint development zone within their EEZ. So this is the problem.
Thank you. Thank you. Why don't we have a lot more time. I'm going to take a few questions from the audience as we continue. If you have a question, raise your hand, and we have someone with a microphone, someone who can walk around. Right. Why don't we go over here?
I have a question on Taiwan. The new government of Tsai Ing-wen, she was just elected in January, and she was inaugurated in May, and the cross-strait relations a little bit not so good as the previous administration in Ma Ying-jeou administration. The best example is the tourism industry has been relatively not so active. I have a question for Dr. Bader, that what would be the prospect of, the cross-strait relations given President Tsai Ing-wen is very pragmatic. She does not say, obviously, that she would like to accept the 92 consensus, but she is willing to talk to China, and she's accept a status quo, etc. And what would be the prospect for Taiwan's international participation given President Tsai's pragmatism? And also maybe Professor Liu would be commenting on from the Chinese point of view. And the second question following that is, if Hillary Clinton is elected, do you expect any change on U.S.-Taiwan policy vis-a-vis the new administration in Taiwan?
Well, I agree that Tsai Ing-wen has been pragmatic and been careful in her approach to cross-strait relations. She had the experience during the Chen Shui-bian years, which led to confrontation. She was part of that administration, and she did not wish to repeat that experience. So she has been explicit up front that Taiwan will not seek a referendum on its status, that it accepts the Constitution of the Republic of China, under which Taiwan and the mainland are part of one country. But as you say, she does not accept the One China principle or the 1992 consensus that were the basis for talks. And that, as I'm sure Professor Liu will explain, means that she gets a grade of incomplete from the Chinese point of view, and that China has decided the talks are not possible. The U.S. obviously wants to see relations between the two sides continue to be fruitful and productive, the kinds of progress that we've seen in the Ma Ying-jeou years in terms of cross-strait flights, cross-strait trade, cross-strait investment. We think that helps diminish tensions. That's in the interest of all concerned. But this is not for us to decide. This is for Beijing and Taiwan to decide. I would be personally surprised if the international community provided more opportunities for Taiwan's participation in international organizations, so long as the PRC takes a negative view about it. Because the PRC is a member of all these organizations, and they can prevent Taiwan from taking its place. And finally, as for Hillary Clinton and Taiwan, look, the U.S. has had a policy on Taiwan and Taiwan's status since 1979, since we normalized relations with the PRC, the passage of the Taiwan Relations Act. Hillary Clinton is well versed in that history. She knows it well. I would be extremely surprised if she decided that Taiwan and cross-strait relations were an area to break new ground or to throw out 40 years of history.
Let me take that question a little broader and make it a little more provocative. So not just Hillary Clinton, but she's running someone else you might have heard, Donald Trump. He's had a lot of things to say about many things, including China and Asia. So what can we expect from both of them? From what does a Donald Trump foreign policy towards the U.S.-China relationship look like? What does a Hillary Clinton policy look like, not just towards Taiwan, but towards the U.S.-China relationship? Pastor Hakkasan?
Asking me?
Yes.
I thought you were asking him. Okay.
I'm going to ask all of you. This
Okay.
is like the best question around.
Now, yeah, it's a damn good question. I think if Hillary Clinton is elected president, there will be far more continuity in U.S. policy, and that would be generally welcome, I think, by all countries in the region. However, I think no U.S. president can kind of ignore the mood that has brought Trump the Republican nomination and before that sustained Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primary. It's a somewhat mood of caution towards the external world. It is manifested itself in anti-trade mood, hence the uncertainty over whether the TPP will pass Congress during the lame duck session. I think it will eventually pass Congress if Hillary Clinton is elected. But this new mood is a fact that no president can ignore. Very hard for me to say what a Trump presidency would mean for East Asia because he has not said very much in terms of policy. He has made some slogans, he has said some provocative statements. But one thing I think strikes me is when he says he's for America first. Now, every country is for its own country first. But I think what he meant is he intends to take, or he thinks, a more transactional approach towards relationships and regions is in order. Now, that worries me a little bit because these big strategic adjustments, the groping towards a new accommodation between the US and China, cannot be dealt with by a purely transactional approach. You heard what Jeff Bader said about the main US interest in Southeast Asia, South China Sea, the ability to operate in and through. And I think if I put myself in the mind of Mr. Trump, he might calculate, all right, nobody's going to stop me, so why do I care about the rest? But that puts a different complexion, and it may set the other countries of the region on a different trajectory in their relationships between the US and China. All the countries of the region, with the possible exception of Cambodia, really want to have the best possible relationship with both. But if you take an overly transactional approach towards the diplomacy and the strategy of the region, you might upset, you wouldn't mean to, but you might upset the kind of balance that we are looking for.
Very interesting. Professor Liu, what's your answer to the question about Hillary Clinton, and also what does the Chinese make of a potential Donald Trump presidency?
This week I visited DC. I talked with many think tanks. I think a lot of think tanks don't want to talk about Trump. They don't think this guy will become a president. Yeah. So for China, I don't think we pay a lot of attention to this guy. Yeah. But we just assume that he become a president. So neither Hillary nor Trump could change state course across the street. This is over 20 years, no matter it's a Republican or Democrat. I think this is clear. Trump is also part of American political system. He could not change Republican policy. He could not change all the previous the president or administration's commitment. So he will not abandon Taiwan. So this is, I think we don't worry about that. Since Chen Shui-bian's what he called 一边一国, I think everything has been, most of the things has been decided. Taiwan is a very tiny entity. It could not change China and U.S. national interests. The national interest both of us share is clearly stated course. Yeah. The second point is about Tsai Ing-wen. I think after she gives this inaugural address, I think in mainland there are different views. One view think is quite pragmatical. It's quite different with Chen Shui-bian. She claimed it will not challenge mainland or this one China policy. This is clear. But what China Taiwan's office made different views. This is incomplete goal. Yeah, it means a road. Yeah, Tsai Ing-wen should finish. It means she should finally accept 1992 consensus one China. I think there are two things change after Chen Shui-bian and left the so-called presidential office. One is that during the Ma Ying-jeou's rule, we see those student movement, particularly last year, so-called Sunflower movement. It means those young people, they grew up during Li Denghui and Chen Shui-bian era. They become a kind of a people, a kind of a winner for de-Chinaization. So they don't like China very much. So this is something worry and give some vigilance to Chinese leaders. So we pay attention to what's so-called a kind of a cultural independence. I think the current maybe Taiwan leader will advocate.
Right.
Yeah. Another point I just added, just one sentence that China now, because it's rising and in international arena. So mainland, I think we have a more leverage to balance Taiwan. So we wait. We will have more time to wait.
Great, thank you. And Jeff, for the provocateur, what can we expect from a Trump presidency in the U.S.-China relationship?
Yeah, I've been asked that before, and what would be the impact on China policy and Asia policy? And my answer to that is that suppose you had an asteroid heading towards Earth, and collision with Earth was imminent. Would your principal concern be what's going to be the impact on U.S.-China relations, or would that be kind of a footnote? So that's my basic answer. As you all can tell, I'm not expecting to go to work in the Trump administration. But to try to answer more seriously, not much more seriously, what has he said about Asia? Okay, he said China's raping the U.S. By the way, he says that that's not China's fault, which tells us something about Donald Trump's conception of rape. It's a victim's fault in Trump's view. We should impose 45% tariffs on Chinese products. We don't care about human rights in China. We don't care about human rights anywhere. The U.S. has enough problems in the area of human rights, and the era where we are being missionaries and trying to tell the world about values like human rights will be over, in his view. Japan, South Korea, they don't pay enough. At the outset, he seemed to think they didn't pay anything for U.S. forces there. We're just doing them a favor by having U.S. forces there. It's not a U.S. interest. And unless they pay up to what he deems to be a satisfactory level, good luck to them in terms of their security. And when asked if that might mean that they would go nuclear, he'd say, yeah, that's okay, no problem, that's all right, which would turn its back on 50 years of U.S. non-proliferation policy. South China Sea, he hasn't said anything. In Southeast Asia, he hasn't said anything. He seems to have no knowledge or interest in Southeast Asia.
That's good.
Yeah, and Trans-Pacific Partnership, as we know, Hillary Clinton has been negative. He has been apoplectic. So I think I agree with Ambassador Bilahari that a year into a Clinton administration, we might see the political dynamics in the United States changing, and then the administration have to take another look at it, whether they wanted to or not. Who knows what Trump would do. So, I mean, the long and short of it, though, is given Trump's volatility and the fact that he has no history of any interest in public policy issues, not. What his policies will be is completely unpredictable in the region. Will they be pragmatic? Maybe. His advisors, such as they are, on Asia and China, the names I have heard are not people that I would call people who believe engagement with China. But again, I don't know that his advisors, that we should take any names that we've heard so far very seriously. Just a word or two on Clinton. I mean, she has a lot of experience in Asia. She made, as you say, she made her first trip to Asia. I went on any number of trips with her to Asia. She was deeply involved in Asia policy with the rebalance. She's met with all Asian leaders. She's invested in U.S. policy towards Asia. And I think one should expect a high degree of continuity. I mean, there are more specifics we could say, but I think Ari has said that. Continuity is to be expected.
Thank you. Yeah, my next question was going to be, how bad could things get in U.S.-China relationship? I think the first part of your answer answered that pretty clearly. Let me go around and see who else has questions. Cal?
Cal Rostiello, UCLA. So I'm curious how the panelists interpret China's unwillingness to participate in the arbitral process around the South China Sea in light of U.S. interest in a rules-based international order. So how do you read that, not with regard to South China Sea, but more generally about where we should expect things in the future?
Anyone? Jump ball.
I'll say just a quick word. None of us expected them to participate in it. I didn't expect them to welcome the ruling. I think we would all hope that their actions will not be generally inconsistent with the outcome. They have not indicated that they will act consistent. They've been pretty restrained since the ruling came through. But I think the ruling was an important ruling, whether China accepts it or not, because it lays out the basic framework under international law for how the South China Sea issues should be resolved, not the sovereignty issues, but the other issues. And I think in the long term, not immediately, but in the long term, all the parties are going to have to use that as a reference point and think about how to resolve problems.
Right.
Let me just state one word. I think that China would not recognize the tribunal and not recognize its ruling is entirely predictable. But I agree with Jeff that the ruling is nonetheless of great legal significance beyond the South China Sea, because it interprets certain parts of UNCLOS that has not been interpreted before, and that has a very wide significance beyond the South China Sea, which may one day be of use to China itself. Who knows?
Great. Let's go for another question here. Yes, right over here.
Hi, Tom Lee, Pomona College. Question for Dr. Liu. You spoke about how one issue in the South China Sea is that the countries are not willing to make concessions. So what specific concessions would China give in the other countries that would lead to a more agreeable outcome?
Now, I don't think it's the right time. First, I think we need some gradual steps. Like fishing rights, I think both if China and the Philippines, now we will restart kind of talks. But it's not based on the dry 12th ruling. This is clear. What we said, we not accept, not implement this ruling, doesn't mean that we oppose a kind of law by law. We say we oppose it based on the law, because there are different articles, clauses mentioning that China could not, has the right not accept such kind of arbitration. So this is some conflicting clauses. So this is the first point. And then I think if Philippines, Vietnam, we could find some way to talk something about fishing rights, about some scientific cooperation, and even about some like Coast Guard and joint patrol. I think that will be a paved way for future maybe cooperation. But this could not be totally solved. It will be very difficult. I think it will take a long time. We'll wait for at least the next generation.
One issue that we talked about a little before, but this panel wouldn't be complete without, would be North Korea, of course. Last week, North Korea tested a nuclear weapon. We sit in California, a state that North Korea is desperately trying to get in its range of its missiles. This is a core issue of U.S.-China relations, and one that has been a bit of Groundhog Day, with every American administration talking about some of the same issues, talking about the need to do more. So, Jeff, you worked on this a huge amount. What can we expect next, and is there a path for greater U.S.-China diplomacy to change and blunt the threat from North Korea, which seems to just be growing every day?
Admiral Harris referred to it last night. This is the #1 security issue for the United States in the region. You know, South China Sea, it's important, there are lots at stake there, but this is one that has to do with U.S. national security because of the risk of North Korea mating some of its nuclear warheads, miniaturized warheads, with ICBMs of greater range. So, to me, the next administration is obviously going to have to review our North Korea policy because we've been, look, I spent a lot of time on it, and I wouldn't be particularly self-critical of what we did, because I don't really know what the right solution was. I don't think that anyone has a bright idea. But next administration is going to have to review it, and they're going to have to figure out how to get greater support from China. There is some sentiment, I think, within the Clinton camp about increasing pressure on North Korea, and that means, in their minds, increasing pressure on China to increase pressure on North Korea. Now, whether that's the best way to get results from China and North Korea, time will tell. But there's certainly going to have to be a stronger U.S.-China effort vis-a-vis North Korea, because I went on a trip to China in 2010, or no, 2009, early in the administration, and basically warned with the Deputy Secretary of State, Jim Steinberg, and we warned the Chinese that if North Korea continued on its current path, we were going to be forced to take actions, we meaning the United States, in the region that China would not like, that would impinge on Chinese national security interests. And we alluded to them broadly, but they included things like what we've seen with THAADs, with the deployment of radar in South Korea against North Korean missiles, which China doesn't like because they think it affects their strategic deterrent. Greater deployment of U.S. carriers along the coast of Korea and near Chinese shores. Increase in Japanese security capabilities, strengthening of the U.S.-Japan security alliance. Changes in the parameters in South Korean missiles. A whole slew of changes we forecast, and they've all come to pass because North Korea has continued on its path. I think the ultimate solution, to be candid, and this will not be a matter of U.S. policy, but frankly, it's very hard for me to see how this problem gets solved as long as the Kim dynasty is in power. Now, I don't think you'll see a U.S. administration declaring regime change as an objective. I don't think that's the basis for a policy. But it's hard for me to picture how this problem gets solved short of the disappearance of the Kim dynasty.
Thank you. Excellent. Terry, did you have a question?
Thank you. Thanks for this great discussion. I'd like to posit a thought experiment, if I may. And I'm not trying to downplay the areas where the US and China have competing interests, but just imagine there was an enormous threat that threatened equally China and the United States. And Jeff, you mentioned an asteroid, but what if it were, let's say, another outbreak of something like Spanish flu? The Spanish flu in 1918 killed more than double the amount of people who died in the First World War. And supposing this flu were to break out, I'm curious how, and assuming that we would need enormous cooperation between China, the largest population in the world, and the United States with the best medical facilities and so on, how would that work in practice? We heard earlier from Admiral Blair after the Hainan Island crash. It was 20 hours before the US and China could talk. If you're in a major crisis, an epidemic, you kind of need to have these things work. And I'm wondering, does the mechanism exist in both the US government and the Chinese government to say, you know what, we have a serious problem here, the security, the future of the planet is at stake. How would that play out who would talk to whom, and how would that work? I wonder, I'd be curious to know from Yuming and also Jeff, if you have, and Bilahari too, if you have views on that type of a crisis.
Why don't we start with the Chinese perspective? What do you think?
This is a long debate, and I think different views. And what I tell you this is my own views. First, this North Korea nuclear development already passed many red lines, and this is Kim Jong-un's strategic goal. So this trend has gone too far, and I don't think it could be brought back. This is irresistible until this regime collapses. So this is the first point. Second is that China and US both should take a responsibility. And for China, I always think that when we deal with North Korea, we think six-party talks, and we think 2003 to 2008, at this time, Bush administration and China, US, we had a very good cooperation. And the Bush administration trusts China very much because it was fully preoccupied with anti-terrorism. Yeah. But nowadays, U.S.-China have a lot of competition in South China Sea and military relations, which offset a kind of a cooperation on the North Korea issue. The third issue is that China will try its best to screw up, to give more pressure. And this time, I think that after the fifth nuclear test, I think China will take some new measures, particularly for this living hold, and for the North Korea export to coal to China. I think China will take a more limitation to restrain North Korea, gain more money from the outside.
Interesting. I mean, one of the core premise of that question is a goal of a large part of the Obama administration was to develop mechanisms to do exactly that. The strategic and economic dialogue, the initial improvement of military-to-military communication is to make sure that you have a hotline and have a set of conversations. In a sense, part of the goal, and Jeff, let me know what you think about this, is every meeting between the President of the United States and the President of China should not be a summit. It should be regular and routine diplomacy that happens at all levels. And it's for that reason is these types of issues don't have the band playing and you lead up and everyone's wondering where the rolling credits are going to look like. It's something that happens normally. Jeff, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, what Admiral Blair talked about in 2000 when the Chinese took 20 hours to pick up the phone, and I think they're still waiting for General Xiong Guangkai to call back, situation has changed. I remember in 2009, we had an incident in between the U.S. Impeccable, which is a ship that was in Chinese exclusive economic zone, and Chinese fishing boats. The Chief of Naval Operations, the U.S. used the new hotline established to call the Admiral Wu Shengli, the head commander of the Chinese Navy, called him right away. They talked about it, and they talked about how to de-escalate. There are a whole series of communications channels, digital, secure, that didn't exist. There's a natural asymmetry, Terry. I mean, the U.S. commanders are, I think, fairly comfortable communicating with counterparts in crisis situations or semi-crisis situations. Chinese, much less so. The clearance process is much more complicated on the Chinese side, and that's why the Chinese didn't call back after Hainan. But there has been so much effort, Matt at DOD would have seen this, into having these mechanisms for communication at command levels and operational levels built up over recent years. But let me just, on a negative note on that, going back to Korea, one of the things that many of us on the US side have been trying to get going with the Chinese for many years is some sort of dialogue with the Chinese about possible collapse scenarios in North Korea. Suppose something happens in North Korea. Suppose there's unrest or instability, which is not a preposterous scenario. What's going to happen? It's a nuclear state. South Korea's got interests. China has interests. The U.S. has interests. Are troops going to move south of the Yalu? Are they going to move north of the 38th parallel? Are the Chinese and South Korean and U.S. forces going to find themselves in close proximity? And we've had no talks, no discussions about such scenarios. The Chinese don't want to have them because they're looking over the shoulder at the North Koreans. They don't trust us not to leak what would happen in such talks. They think it will complicate their relations with North Korea. So we have the risk of some sort of a crisis in North Korea, and U.S., Chinese, South Korean, and whatever's left of North Korean forces encounter each other with no preparation and no background. That's an unacceptable situation.
To close us out for the panel?
I'll repeat a point. First of all, I think if there is a common threat, I think the US and China will work together. It's a question of how long they will take to work together. But I don't think, for reasons I said yesterday, that North Korea is one of those issues that they will work together. There is common concern, but I don't think there is the US and China do not define their interests in the same way. Just to summarize what I said yesterday, I think China, there is always going to be a limit to how much pressure China is going to put on a fellow communist regime. It will never be to the point where that regime risks collapse, because if the Chinese Communist Party is complicit in the destruction of another communist system, that will give the Chinese people evil thoughts about their own system. And that's the bottom line. And that's probably also why they are very reluctant to discuss what to do in terms if there is a self-generated collapse, shall we say. My guess it would be the PLA will move in to prop up some form of, maybe not a Kim regime, but some form of communist system.
Excellent. Well, everyone, thank you very much for your insights, your humor, and your perspective. Thank you very much.